Welcome to the stage, ecologist, data scientist, and founder of Vibrant Data Labs, Eric Berlow.
All right, here we go. All right, hey guys. Hi, can you guys hear me all right back there? We're all cozy. If you guys want to move up, it's fine. It's a big space, I realize, so don't hesitate to come on in. Yeah, we got time. It's good. Welcome, everybody. Kicking off. We're like the first talk of the weekend. Yay. So anyway, my name's Eric Berlow, and before I get going, I'm a founder of Vibrant Data Labs, but also I want to just acknowledge that what I'm presenting today, it started as a solo project, but now a lot of this work is done by this whole team together. We're a group of equal partners, equal pay, a team, and so I just want to put my hats out to them. Some of you who may know me, I'm an ecologist, but also with 3 of the 4 data scientists on our team are also ecologists, so we approach a lot of our problems with an ecological lens. Our work has spanned everything from understanding keystone species in marine ecosystems to understanding the effects of climate change on alpine meadows to protecting and conserving endangered amphibians in Yosemite National Park. So I have that ecological background. And our work has also spanned understanding nature as a complex system. So if you take a map, you take a map of who eats whom in a system, what you end up with is a food web, which reveals the architecture of how energy flows in nature. And so I left my academic career, this is work that I did with colleagues like way back in like the early 2000s, and late 90s. And I left my academic career about 15 years ago to apply that training about complex systems to other problems in society. And I've worked on, since then, a wide range of things, complex problems, everything from Middle Eastern conflict to algorithmic disinformation to data privacy, like the early days of the Global Data Protection Regulation. A few years ago, I got this great fellowship with Emerson Collective, and it helped me pivot my career to focus on climate change. And in that, the idea was to try to track how money flows to climate solutions. And the reason why I have this up here is to say it's the same methods, the same statistics. Instead of who eats whom, it's just who funds whom. And it's all kind of the same thing. And this ecosystem view of climate funding, this project was called the Climate Finance Tracker. And the idea was really simple. It was like, how do we just help everybody see the big picture? Because climate is a really complex problem. Nobody will ever solve it alone. It's an all hands on deck problem, and yet none of the hands seem to know what the others were doing. So I thought, let's just try to make that more transparent. This project is philanthropically supported. It's a public resource. It's open source. And the current version tracks over $400 billion in investments in philanthropy to over 10,000, this is US focused right now, US based organizations that are climate relevant. And we're tracking about 14,000 funders and investors. And so every dot here is a company in blue or a nonprofit in red. So we track both, private and profit and nonprofit. And then, okay, so sorry. And then the other thing was, I wanted to, so let's go back to 1, 2. I want to share with you 5 things that I've learned in doing this over the past couple of years. Because I didn't know anything about climate finance when I started. So what I learned, number 1, was that money goes to solutions, not problems. And it may seem obvious, but we spend a lot of time talking about problems. And there's 10,000 entities here working on real solutions, which was really inspiring to explore. The second is we actually know what to do with climate. And like I said, I've worked on a lot of complex problems. I don't know any that we actually have clear roadmaps for what to do, that there's scientific consensus that's saying if we do all this stuff, we win. And it's really well defined. It's unique amongst complex problems. The third thing is that if we actually do those things, it's actually a better world for everybody, like independent of tackling climate change. And so that's really important to remember. The challenge is that it's a lot to do, and unfortunately, it all needs to be done to win. We can't, if anything goes unfunded, we lose. And the trends are that a lot of the money goes to a few shiny solutions, and so that means that there are a lot of holes to fill. That also means that for anybody who's an innovator, like all you guys, there's a hole for you to fill. There's a lot of cool things to do. So that's pretty much it. You could leave now. Like that's kind of what I want to outline. but honestly, when I started this, when I would think about climate change, I thought mostly about, it made me feel fear and dread and despair and anxiety and guilt. And at the time, it felt like the only form of climate action was just shouting from the rooftops to convince people that the problem is real. But as I've gotten into it, the only thing I can think of is this is an insane opportunity to craft a better future for everybody. It's amazing. So in our little time together right now, I hope we can move from dread and despair to this feeling of excitement and agency. And before I do that, I do want to be crystal clear on why there is the despair part, because this is an existential problem. It really is. And it's not only that, but it's one that has a deadline that's fast approaching. So let's have a quick look at that history of the problem and the seismic shift that we're seeing in the past decade. So climate, in addition to knowing the solutions, it's the only problem I know where we've got 100 million years of data to put our current situation right here into context. 100 million years, this is 100 million years of global temperature. The zero line there is the 1850 to 1900 pre-industrial average. So when people wonder, like, what's the big deal with 1 or 2 degrees, 3 degrees Celsius, when 100 million years ago, the Earth's temperature was, 15 to 20 degrees C hotter, right? Well, like, it's just natural variation. Well, back then, there were no humans. Crocodiles roamed the Arctic. Humans only showed up about 250,000 years ago, right around here. And during that period, the Earth's temperature went up and down about 7 degrees C, a higher 2 degrees up and 5 degrees down. So kind of what's the big deal? We've done that before. Well, it turns out during that time, humans were migratory. They moved all around searching for the good climate. And civilization only developed during this period about 10,000 years ago, when the Earth's climate stabilized remarkably across this past 10,000 years to within a half a degree Celsius, plus or minus, during this entire time. That's when agriculture was developed, civilization was developed as we know it. So we really depend on that's the corridor of life, they call it. And it turns out that if you go back in the fossil record to these migratory humans back during the Pleistocene, they actually moved around on Earth to places that were within that narrow temperature band. So this is real. Like, we've got context, and we are just last year surpassing that window, right? So this is serious. So if that doesn't convince you, the risks are crystal clear. Here is a report that was published just a couple months ago in Forbes, reporting on a report around that there's been a prediction of a 50% GDP collapse within decades. And this report was not done by a bunch of eco-freaks. This was done by the International Institute of Actuaries. Actuaries are the most conservative of all professional financial risk analysts. And they are predicting that climate-driven economic shocks will not behave like past recessions. They talk about entire industries could crumble. Pensions could vanish. The financial foundation of modern life is at risk. From the report, actuaries. Think about it. These are from actuaries. And the timescale of this is when your children will become adults. I will probably be dead by then, but not your children. So the risks are clear. And we've understood the root cause of this for over 150 years. So let's zoom into this 150-year window here in the far right and spread that out. For 150 years, we've known about this problem, more so. From the very first papers linking CO2 concentration to air temperature in 1856 by Eunice Foote, to the first model of the greenhouse effect in 1896, Eunice Foote's predictions of how much global temperature would increase with a doubling of CO2 are similar to the average of all of the complex simulations we have today. We don't have this 1856 Eunice Foote. In the 60s, we had the first empirical observations of actually increasing CO2, atmospheric CO2 with the Keeling curve. And then in the mid 80s, we had congressional testimonies by Carl Sagan and Jim Hansen in the mid-1980s. Carl Sagan's testimony was really, it's amazing to watch on YouTube. I really recommend it. You can see like a young Al Gore being schooled on what is the greenhouse effect, taking notes, and everything, and he's really learning about it. Jim Hansen's testimony a couple years later was when there was an extreme heat wave, and he provided the first scientific evidence that global warming had actually arrived. That was 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago. Since then, we've had not one, but 6 international scientific consensus reports, unequivocally linking all those changes to human activity. And then even with all this remarkable body of evidence, the public wasn't really convinced. So then we had people like Al Gore, like Al Gore and others, who were to try to take all that scientific evidence and make it crystal clear to the public that the problem is real. We still didn't really do that much. So the root causes of this problem are understood like no other social problem I can think of. And yet, even after 150 years, we hadn't done a lot. Then things started changing. In the last 20 years, last 20 years, we see a really big shift. So we went from, so here's Al Gore again on the left here, spread out, 2006. We went from convincing everybody there's the problems, shouting from the rooftops, to then outlining and road mapping and defining the solutions. From Project Drawdown to One Earth Speed and Scale is like John Doerr's Action OKR Plan for the Planet, to the International Energy Agency. So let me just kind of walk through a couple of those. Drawdown was the first book published. They did an amazing job of just really clarifying where all the emission sources from different industries, and then what are the sinks. Most people don't actually know that of all the emission sources from food and industry, electricity, buildings, and everything else, over 40% of it currently is sucked up by nature, by nature's from land sinks and ocean sinks. We need to expand that, but it's kind of remarkable. So they propose over 100 solutions that span a whole bunch of different industries to reduce the sources, support the sinks, and improve society. It's pretty simple. And these are all amazing solutions. They're just revamping their entire solution library. They'll release it this summer. It's an amazing resource. So that's Drawdown. I want to dive into One Earth. They're a fiscal sponsor, another partner. We collaborate with them a lot. They released their first model 2 years later. They have 2 models. In their framework, it boils down to 3 main solution pillars to reach net zero and by 2050 and limit warming to 1.5, 2 degrees. The first is 100% transition to renewable energy and mobility. The second is to protect and restore 50% of terrestrial and coastal ecosystems. We call that 50% by 2050. And then we need 100% net zero food and fiber production. So high level, all these roadmaps are pretty similar. In the One Earth framework, these are broken down into 12 subpillars and about over 80 more specific solution pathways. Each of them is integrated with this global climate model that's published in Nature Springer, and that says if we do all this, we can limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees C without really having to invent too much new. So, in the One Earth framework, they also explicitly include other cross-sectional themes like social justice and biodiversity, and different levers of change, like not just science and technology, but also, policy and governance and community action. So, the good news is that if we do all this, it's actually a better future for everybody. So forget the dread and fear part. This is actually a better solution for everybody. If we tackle the energy pillar, we solve for energy security and energy poverty and air pollution at the same time. If we tackle regenerative agriculture pillar, we solve for food security and food poverty, and we lower healthcare costs at the same time. We also clean up our rivers and streams at the same time. If we solve for the nature pillar, we also solve the biodiversity crisis at the same time. And if we do it right, we also improve the livelihoods of rural communities, and we get clean air and water for free. This is all just better for everybody. And we don't even have to tell anybody that we solved the climate crisis. Like, it's just better, okay? And I really want to stress this, especially in this current political environment. So the money goes to the solutions, not the problem. And this is clear. Once we started to shift from convincing everybody there's a problem to actually defining the solutions, the money started to move. So let me just show you some data. This is data we compiled from Crunchbase on all of the funding rounds to venture-backed companies that are climate relevant, deemed climate relevant by our model. Each year summarizes all the funding rounds. That includes venture equity rounds as well as debt and grant rounds. And then it's skyrocketed. So note that once we shifted to solution thinking, the funding to climate relevant companies increased 11-fold in 7 years. It's remarkable. So the one question might be, well, is this just like, a market trend, like things just got better in general? Well, to compare that or to test that idea, we went back to Crunchbase and just looked at a random sample from the broader market. So that's the band there. So just to go over that, the solid blue line is funding rounds to climate relevant companies where we have a language model to read the descriptions and flag them as climate relevant. And then for all those rounds, I took a sample of the same size of non-climate companies, a random sample, did it 1,000 times. So the hollow circles are the median of those 1,000 samples, and the band is the variability across them, the interquartile range. All this to say, it's really clear that this growth right here, that the growth in funding is a climate trend, not a market trend. The solid line really deviates from all those random samples. It's a real thing. It's real momentum. And it's spanned over 2 administrations. Note that 2017 was Trump 1.0's first year. It started there. It accelerated during the Biden administration. And it's going. We'll see what happens now. But all I can say is that this is not just due to government subsidies. This is a real trend in the private market. And if somebody could say, I don't believe in climate change, I don't believe in investing in those solutions, it's kind of like in the early 2000s saying, I don't believe in the internet. Like, this is real momentum. Okay, so the opportunity is we know what needs to be done, and the money is actually moving to those solutions. The challenge is that we actually don't know where the money is going specifically, and is it going to all these roadmaps, to the solutions that have been defined? So why does that matter? What that matters because, and I'm going to say this a number of times, there is a lot to do, and unfortunately, it all needs to be done. We can't win with just like one thing. It all needs to be done. So we've been trying to build a general method to map, to shine a light on underfunded gaps in these systems. Currently, for this and any other solution roadmap, nobody knows like how much money is going to each of those red boxes, or those colored boxes. They don't know how much is going, where are the gaps. So that's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to fill that gap. And we're building some general methods to do that. We've done it for One Earth. I'm going to show you that. We're hopefully going to be doing it with Drawdown this summer. We've done it for a few other folks on different taxonomies. So to do that, how do we do it? We went back to the original climate finance tracker data, which was really just designed as a browsing tool. I'll show you in a minute, just to find who's doing what. And then in each of those things, we use language data. So for every one of these companies or nonprofits, like electric bikes here, e-bikes, we scrape and synthesize how they describe their work in their own words from their website and their LinkedIn profile. And then we use that language to map each of these 10,000 companies and nonprofits to their best fit, conceptual fit along this whole taxonomy. So here's a first ever big picture view of how all that $400 billion in funding is distributed across all of the One Earth pillars, sub-pillars, and solutions. So where the width of the bar is how much money is going there, and the width of the lane is how much cascades down to the sub-pillars or solutions within. Now, people often ask me, oh, you're looking at all the funding and the big picture view, like where are the biggest gaps? What's the biggest gap and the biggest, most important gap? The problem is that it's kind of the opposite problem, that all the money is going to a few wide lanes here, and there's a lot of other gaps everywhere. So if you want to fill a gap, there are plenty of places to make a difference here. There's a lot of opportunities depending on your interests. So I'm gonna walk through these with a few different views. Let's just start with the high-level pillars, and we'll get right into it. So here's another way to look at the same data. It shows how much average annual funding flowed to each of the One Earth pillars of energy mobility, nature conservation, energy mobility, nature conservation, and regenerative agriculture, fixing the food system. The solid bars are private investments, mostly startups, venture-backed companies. And then the dash bars are nonprofits, so philanthropy to nonprofits. So a couple patterns here are really clear. First of all, 80% of the total funding was venture investments in energy and mobility. Not surprising, but sometimes you got to quantify the obvious. and also, while this market momentum is amazing, we will fail if we don't also tackle nature and food. So we really got to pay attention to that. There's a glaring market gap in nature conservation. It's not a profitable area to invest in. There actually are a few investments in there, but it's like less than 1% of all the ventures going to nature. It also, and we can't do it without increasing none of the models work if we don't also increase the lung capacity of nature to inhale carbon. It just doesn't work. So this is also the one place where in absolute terms, philanthropic donations to nonprofits is 5 times larger in absolute terms than investments. So that's something we got to fix, or we got to bring even more philanthropy to it. So even though we've got this big energy part, to know if there's gaps within it, we need to break it down in more detail. And that's where sometimes these big reports that just show like how much money went to big sectors isn't that helpful, because we want to get inside there. And now for the first time we can do that. We can go back to that energy pillar and then redistribute all the money to the sub-pillars and solutions within. And so now we can plot, for example, here to say what fraction of all the energy-related investments went to each solution within each sub-pillar of renewable power, renewable heat, renewable transport, and energy efficiency. So at this scale, we can start to see more granular gaps. At the sub-pillar level, less than 5% of all that energy venture went to renewable heat, even though that's like 40% of global emissions. It's also 2/3 of industrial energy demand, so it's a huge thing for decarbonizing industry. And then if we go to the solution level, we can see that of all that money, almost 50% of the energy and mobility venture went to 2 solutions, solar and electric transport. Those advances, we've all experienced them, have been amazing, and less than 5% went to innovations in how that renewable energy will be transmitted and connected and distributed to the electric transport demand. So we got to fill these gaps. If we don't fill that gap, that grid gap, everybody will be driving coal-powered electric cars. There's dependencies in the system. One thing won't do it alone, and the success of that thing depends on the success of something else. Now, this is a pretty intuitive, obvious example in some ways, but I got to stress that we couldn't see these kind of patterns before very easily at this level of granularity and with the flexibility to slice it and dice it in different ways. So let me just give you another dimension of that, another gap in energy in another way. So remember, the goal is to get renewable energy and mobility to 100% of the people. That only can happen if 100% of the people have access to that. So how do we look at that? And how do we know who's doing it? So that's why these intersectional themes that One Earth has outlined are really important. Things like social justice and sustainable livelihoods are not just a moral obligation, they're actually central to our success, because we need everybody to be part of this new energy economy. So to get at that, to address how many of these climate tech companies are actually addressing inequities in renewable energy access, we went back to the language of how they all describe their work, and then we could then highlight, for example, what fraction of them mention people-centered language on their websites, like the intent to serve low-income, underserved, or rural communities. So here, every bar now is like a pie chart for each solution. And then the dark red area is the fraction of companies tagged to that solution that mention people-centered language on their websites. The point here is that those dark red parts of the bars are really small. Less than 7% of the companies overall mention the intent to serve the underserved. There's a really pervasive access gap in clean energy tech. A lot of the strategy is let's build for the rich and then hope that eventually it becomes cheaper, rather than let's design for everybody up front so that it scales quicker. So what if we look at the nonprofits in this space? So I'm going to stack those on top. Here we can see that those dark red, so those are all the nonprofits tagged to energy and mobility and the different solutions. There, the dark red fractions of those bars is a lot bigger. Over 60% of nonprofits that were tagged to energy and mobility are working on the intent to fill this gap in access. So even though there's a lot of money and there's markets and everything going to energy and mobility, a lot of philanthropists might wonder, well, what's a role for me to play, or a nonprofit, what can they do? They're actually playing a really important role here to try to get the energy tech out to everybody. And it's an access problem, it's also a scaling problem, right? So now, we talked about two gaps, transmission and access. Who are those so now, because we have the data, we could go to those dark red bars right there. Who's inside there? Who are we'll call them the positive deviants that are filling both the grid gap and the transmission gap? Well, to do that, we can go back to our climate finance tracker, which is sort of like shopping for climate solutions, and dive in, and we can filter on who got tagged to transmission in the One Earth framework. Which of those? Let's look at the nonprofits first. We can go see who they are and go through them one by one and see, for example, like the Clean Energy Group. They help bring distributed clean energy to marginalized communities. It's an explicit part of their mission. Or we could look at something like EarthSpark International, where they develop community microgrids that enhance reliable power in underserved areas. In the tracker, you can also go to their website in the upper right, click on that, and go learn more about what they're doing, and hear about their work on microgrids and how they're empowering, not only empowering communities with reliable power, but also reducing their energy costs by up to 80%. It's just better. And these are the positive deviants that are tackling both the grid gap and the access gap. What about in the for-profit space? We can go to that. Let's go back to the tracker. We could dive in and say, okay, who's working on transmission again? But now let's find anybody that mentions underserved communities or low-income communities on their websites, and they're a for-profit company. There's not that many, you can see. Who are they? Who are those positive deviants? And then dive in and say, oh, here's one, Spark Meter. They explicitly work on enhancing electricity access to underserved markets through grid management solutions. And from that, we can also see who's funding them. Who are these positive deviant funders who are funding those companies that are actually filling the gaps? Like Elemental Impact is amazing. We're doing some work with them, and they're one of those funders that is funding that kind of a company. Or someone like Box Power, where they advance energy resilience in rural and remote areas. And if we dive into their website and go have a look at them, we can see that they also offer energy solutions for tribal communities, and they build energy sovereignty and resilient infrastructure. These are the positive deviants in energy tech that are explicitly increasing energy independence to the underserved, because it's just better for everybody. And we just got to get over the hump and get there. They're making it scale. So from a complex systems perspective, the absolute simplest way to contribute to tackling a multi-causal complex problem is to mine the gaps. Not any old gaps, but just gaps relative to critical needs. All this requires is two pieces of information. The first is to define those critical needs, or the solutions, which you just said are really well defined. And then the second part is follow the money to them so we can find and fill the holes. That's it. It's really simple. That's what positive deviants do. They mine the gaps. It's the simplest way to contribute and make a difference in a complex multi-causal problem. So let's have a look at the food system. What's going on there? Here is a plot showing, kind of like before, the percent of all the food system investments that went to each solution pathway within each subpillar of regenerative croplands, sustainable rangelands, and food waste reduction. Over 60% of the funding to companies working on food system solutions went to 3 solutions: indoor farming, indoor farming, digital agriculture, and plant-based meats. The indoor farming stuff includes probably things for pot growing, things like that. But so like 3 main solutions, high-techy stuff. If we just consider plant-based meat and dairy, there's been amazing advances there, really. Like, just consider how widely available things like oat milk are, all of it, not just in Brooklyn and Berkeley, right? Like, it's really remarkable in the last few years how widely available it is. But just like the electric transportation issue, the full emissions reduction potential of plant-based proteins requires a supply of net zero plants. But there are pervasive gaps in funding to a suite of regenerative cropland solutions. They're not getting any money. So if we don't fill that gap, everybody's just drinking industrially farmed oat milk that's literally fed by fossil fuel fertilizers. So again, we couldn't see these kinds of patterns that easily before, but now we can do it really, really easily. So let's dive in. Who are the positive deviants here that are filling the regenerative cropland gaps? There's not that many companies doing it. Well, let's go back to our shopping for climate solutions. And here we could identify all the companies working in regenerative croplands. Of those, who are those for-profit entities, and who are the ones we can summarize who are all the investors within there and find ones that are being funded by our positive deviant funders and go see who they are. For example, Nitricity is a really interesting company. They actually make carbon-free fertilizer using renewable electricity, air, and water. Or Propagate, it's an agroforestry company that helps farmers integrate trees with traditional crops and livestock in ways that improve the soil, increase profits for the farmers, and increase the resilience to climate. And again, we could go check out their website and see what they're doing. And these are real positive deviants working on the ground to fill important gaps in neglected areas. Okay, last one. First of all, there really are no silver bullets. This all needs to be done. We could kick butt on energy mobility and regenerative agriculture, and we still need to tackle nature too. So let's just dive into nature real quick. It's the last one. So for the first time, again, we can just automatically redistribute the money in here and see what went here. So this plot shows what fraction of all the funding to nature, this is philanthropic funding mostly because, like I said, it's most of the funding in nature is philanthropy. How much went to each of the sub-pillars of land conservation, ocean conservation, ecosystem restoration, and wildlife connectivity. Wildlife connectivity is things like protecting rivers and streams and land buffers. So about 40% of all the money mapped to nature goes to protected lands, even though these are only, it's like a fraction, less than 20% of the critical lands we need to steward and restore. If we want to conserve 50% of terrestrial and coastal ecosystems by 2050, we can't just put a fence around everything. We can't just make everything a national park. We need to restore nature on degraded lands, on working lands. We need to restore nature where people are living and integrate nature into people's lives. So who are the positive deviants that are doing that? Oh, sorry. So less than 12% of funding in nature is going to all of those ecosystem restoration solutions combined. So who are the positive deviants that are doing that? Let's go have a look real quick. So this is kind of fun. Here, if we go into nature, we can identify who's working on that sub-pillar of ecosystem restoration. And because nature-based solutions tend to be more place-based, we could look at the geographic view and zoom right here into Michigan and see who's doing that kind of work here in the Detroit area. So here we find there's a bunch of entities like the Greening of Detroit. They support urban communities through tree planting and workforce training. They've planted over 150,000 trees in the Detroit area, and at the same time training people in landscaping and urban forestry skills to get jobs. There's organizations like Detroit Hives that transform vacant lots into pollinator spaces, and they support bee populations, revitalize neighborhoods, and support local food initiatives. All this stuff. These are all just better. It's amazing what's going on here throughout this, and it's happening all over the country. So with efforts like that, in 20 years, we'll look back and we'll say, wow, do you remember when we used to have insufferable heat waves in our cities and you couldn't escape from the sun? Do you remember when we used to have to actually drive to go to a national park to be in nature? Do you remember when we used to till the soil every year and the farmers were dependent on and indebted to chemical companies to feed the soil that was degraded? Do you remember when we fed our children vegetables that were laced with hormone-disrupting pesticides? Do you remember when our cities had smog and our children had asthma? Do you remember when we used to have an energy bill? Like, we'll just look back on this. Recently, we electrified our home and we got an induction range, And I was always like a gas, got to cook on gas kind of cooker. Now, when I go to a house and I cook on gas, I think, wow, someday we'll be like, do you remember when we used to light a fire inside our house and pollute our living room just to boil water, and it took forever, and now it takes like minutes on an induction burner? Or if I'm driving around on the street, I think like, wow, do you remember when we used to drive around in vehicles that were powered by little gas explosions, and we had to pay for gas? Like, well, think about it. So my hope is that in maybe, hopefully less than 20 years, we'll look back and we'll say, do you remember when we used to call this the climate finance tracker? It should just be the better future finance tracker. Do you remember when we used to call these climate solutions? They're really just solutions for a better future. All of these frameworks are just roadmaps for a better future. We don't even need to use the word climate. But the crux of it is, if we want that better future, there is a lot to do. There is no silver bullet, as I keep saying. It all needs to be done, and if anything goes undone, we lose. And there are a lot of holes to fill because the money tends to be concentrated in a few shiny objects. So I just leave you with this, that whatever your interests or your skills or your passions, I guarantee you on this problem, there are gaps for you to fill. Whatever you have to offer, whether it's money or time or talent or expertise, there are gaps for you. The simplest way to make a difference is to find a hole and fill it. So my one call to action is just this: be a positive deviant, find a hole and fill it. Thank you very much.